He was 21. His plane was burning, and when he jumped without a parachute, he expected to die. But Nicholas Alkemade didn't hit the ground. He landed in history. The sky was on fire. Flames poured from the rear turret, licking at the oxygen tanks, turning the air thick and metallic. Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade, tail gunner of a Lancaster bomber, blinked through the smoke. His world was shrinking, orange light, boiling air, and the desperate hum of engines dying one by one. They were returning from a raid over Berlin. The flak had been heavier than usual that night. Tracer rounds, black clouds of exploding shells, and a darkness that pulsed like a heartbeat. The bomber shook again. A jolt threw him sideways. Metal screamed as a piece of the fuselage tore loose. He smelled burning cloth, his own. He tried to move, but the turret handle blistered his palm. His parachute, gone. He'd hung it behind him, just outside the turret, before takeoff, regulation placement. Now it was fire. The intercom crackled. "Bail out! Bail out!" Nicholas didn't hesitate. He could either burn or fall. He kicked open the hatch. The roar outside was beyond sound, wind, fire, and gravity colliding all at once. He pulled himself out into the dark, smoke curling around his boots. The cold hit him like a wall of knives. Then he fell. He didn't scream. Not at first. He said later he remembered thinking how quiet it was. The Lancaster burned above him, shrinking into a red wound in the clouds. Below, only blackness, a sea of nothing. He had time to look at the stars. They were oddly calm, steady in the chaos. He thought about how his mother used to say, "When it's your time, you'll know." He knew. Terminal velocity. About 120 miles an hour. No chute, no chance. But then, he saw light. A patch of white far below, snow, and beyond that, trees. He braced. Branches shattered under him. Pine needles exploded across his vision. Something cracked. Maybe his ribs, maybe not. Then the snow rose up and swallowed him whole. Silence. He blinked. Stars again. Only these ones were closer, framed by pine branches. He tried to move. Pain everywhere, but it was pain. He was alive. He lay there for minutes, or maybe hours, unable to believe the math. No parachute. 18,000 feet. And he was breathing. The night was still, except for the faint popping of the burning bomber somewhere miles away. He could smell sap, smoke, and something sweet, pine resin mixing with burnt wool. His leg hurt, his back screamed, but his mind was sharp. He'd fallen out of the sky, and survived. He touched his uniform, torn, scorched, his watch still ticking. "Well then," he muttered, voice rough, "that's new." He dragged himself toward a faint light, a farmhouse maybe. Snow clung to his uniform. Each step left a trail of red behind him. He didn't know if the area was friendly or occupied. Didn't matter. He needed warmth. When the door opened, he saw faces, German faces. A farmer, wide-eyed, a woman clutching a blanket. Nicholas smiled weakly. "Evening," he said in broken German. "I seem to have misplaced my parachute." They didn't laugh. They didn't speak. They just stared, as if they were looking at a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. By morning, the Gestapo would arrive. And when Nicholas told them he'd fallen 18,000 feet without a parachute, they didn't believe him. Not yet, because the real battle wasn't surviving the fall. It was proving it happened. Nicholas Alkemade had survived a fall that should have turned his body into dust. Now he had to survive something worse, disbelief. Morning came pale and hard. The snow glowed silver under the sun, crusted where his blood had frozen overnight. When Nicholas woke, the farmhouse was full of uniforms, black coats, red armbands, boots that didn't belong to farmers. Gestapo. They didn't speak at first, just stared. One of them, tall and angular, leaned close, inspecting the burn marks on his flight suit. Another picked up a scrap of fabric, half melted, half charred. The smell of smoke still clung to it. Then came the question, sharp and cold as the air outside. "Fallschirm? Parachute?" Nicholas shook his head. "No parachute." The officer frowned. Impossible. Nicholas nodded. I agree. They took him away by truck. Wooden benches, tarpaulin roof, rifles across laps. Each jolt sent pain up his spine, but he was past caring. He kept thinking about the fall, how the sky had looked, how the trees had caught him like open hands. The camp they brought him to was small, a holding site for captured airmen, barbed wire, watchtower, the smell of boiled cabbage and diesel. He was led into a makeshift office. A table, 2 chairs, a typewriter. A single window that looked out at nothing but snow. An officer entered. Not Gestapo this time. Luftwaffe. He was older, maybe 40, with tired eyes that had seen too many young men die in flames. His name tag read, Oberleutnant Becker. He sat. You say you jumped from your bomber, Becker began in careful English, but you had no parachute. That's right. And you are alive. So it would seem. Becker studied him. This is unlikely. Nicholas almost smiled. That makes 2 of us. Becker leaned forward. Where did you land? In a forest. Pine trees. Snow broke the fall. From how high? 18,000 feet. The typewriter stopped clacking. The stenographer looked up. Even he couldn't help it. Becker rubbed his temples. 18,000, no parachute, and you survived. Yes. Were you delirious? Maybe you fell with part of the plane. Debris could have slowed. No, sir. I remember it clearly. The aircraft was burning. I climbed out, fell freely. Becker stared at him for a long time. Then he said, If what you say is true, it would be a miracle. Nicholas looked down at his torn gloves. I'm not religious, but I'll take miracle if it fits the paperwork. They examined his injuries, a twisted knee, a gash on his thigh, several bruises, burns, and nothing broken. The camp medic looked at the chart, then at Nicholas. Unmöglich, he muttered again. Impossible. That word would follow him everywhere. By evening, Becker called him back. On the table were objects, bits of cloth, metal, and his dog tag. Next to them lay a map. We found your aircraft, Becker said quietly. It crashed near Schmallenberg. Entire crew lost. Nicholas closed his eyes. He saw their faces. The navigator, the engineer, the pilot. All gone. I was the tail gunner, he said softly. Becker nodded. We found your turret burned. Your parachute also burned completely. He paused. And still you live. They brought him tea, bitter, black, but hot. Becker sat across from him, staring. You understand, Becker said finally. If I send this report, they will think I am insane. Then tell them I am, Nicholas replied. It might help my case. That night, as he lay on the straw cot in his cell, the snow outside glowed faintly blue in the moonlight. He thought of his mother again, of the stars, of falling through the night and finding himself alive on the other side. He whispered to himself, half prayer, half joke. Next time, I'll pack a spare. The Germans had their doubts, but one officer, Becker, would risk his career to prove Nicholas wasn't lying, and what they uncovered next turned an impossible story into documented history. The Germans thought it was impossible. Becker thought it might be a miracle. Either way, someone had to prove it, with evidence. Snow hissed softly against the barracks roof that morning. Nicholas sat on the edge of his cot, boots undone, fingers still raw from the fall. Outside, he heard the scrape of shovels, the crunch of guards changing shifts, and the low hum of a generator somewhere behind the wire. Then boots. Orders barked in German. 2 Luftwaffe men entered, clean uniforms, cold eyes. Sergeant Alkemade, Mitkommen. They led him back to the same office where Becker waited, but this time maps covered the table, aerial photos, crash grids, altitude charts. A small brass ruler lay across a circle drawn in red pencil. Becker didn't look up right away. He was measuring distances. Finally, your plane crashed here, he said, tapping the map near Schmallenberg. The forest where you landed, here. He slid the ruler. 7 kilometers apart. Nicholas nodded. Sounds right. I walked part of it. Becker's brow furrowed. We sent men to the site. They found your turret, completely burned, no parachute, no chute straps. He paused. They also found impressions in the snow, human-shaped. Nicholas leaned forward. Where? Becker pointed again. At the base of several pines. There were broken branches above. 20, maybe 30 meters up. Sap still wet. Snow disturbed underneath. He looked up now, eyes sharper. Does that sound familiar? Nicholas exhaled slowly. Very. A young soldier entered carrying a crate. Inside, torn fabric, pieces of harness, and a small silver buckle. Recovered from the wreckage, Becker said. Parachute harness. Yours? Nicholas reached in, touching the melted webbing. His initials were still visible on the tag. He nodded. That was mine. Becker sat back. Then the story matches. He looked almost relieved. Your turret burned. Your chute destroyed. You jumped without it. You landed. Alive. He rubbed his chin. Still, the impact from that height should kill anyone instantly. Nicholas shrugged. Maybe the forest caught me. Maybe the snow helped. Maybe I was lucky. Becker smiled faintly. You are more than lucky, Sergeant. You are physics' worst nightmare. Word spread through the camp faster than orders. The British prisoner who fell from the sky. Men whispered it over soup lines, repeated it during roll call. Some joked he was made of rubber. Others crossed themselves when he passed. Nicholas didn't feel like a miracle. He felt sore, cold, and hungry. But he also felt lighter. He'd escaped death. And somehow that made the captivity feel smaller, less permanent. A week later, Becker summoned him again. On his desk lay a document stamped in red. Luftwaffe report number 92544. This, Becker said, is your statement. It will be forwarded to Berlin. He tapped the paper. I have written that your account, while highly improbable, appears consistent with physical evidence. The broken trees, the snow, your injuries, they all align. He hesitated, then added quietly, You understand what that means? Nicholas nodded. You're calling me a miracle. Becker smiled thinly. No, I'm calling you probable. That's the closest the Luftwaffe can get to a miracle. They photographed him. Burns, torn uniform, the bruises still deep purple across his shoulders. The camera flashed 3 times. Somewhere in Berlin, an archivist would file those photos under exceptional survival. That night, Becker handed him a cigarette. You'll be transferred soon, he said, to Stalag Luft III, more comfortable conditions. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Comfortable and prison, that's a new combination. Becker smirked. After what you've survived, I think you'll manage. When Nicholas looked out the window before leaving, he saw the forest in the distance, black silhouettes against the snow. Somewhere in there, a crater still marked where he'd hit the earth and lived. He thought of his crew again, 7 men, gone in fire, and him, spared by trees. He whispered softly, If there's a reason, I'll find it. Nicholas Alkemade's fall was now official. But inside the prison camp, surrounded by men broken by war, he'd soon learn that surviving was only half the battle. The real test was remembering why he wanted to live. Nicholas Alkemade had done the impossible, survived a fall from 18,000 feet. Now he faced a new test, surviving captivity among men who no longer believed in miracles. The train was cold and slow, its iron wheels grinding through a frozen landscape. Through the cracks in the wooden slats, Nicholas saw forests slide past, black streaks against the white snow like ink bleeding across paper. Every jolt reminded him of the night he fell. At every stop, German guards paced the platform with rifles slung over shoulders, dogs barking in rhythm with the whistle. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the sign outside read, Sagan, Stalag Luft III. They herded the airmen out one by one, British, Canadian, Australian, all wrapped in thin coats that did nothing against the wind. Nicholas followed, boots crunching in the snow, his breath rising in clouds. Inside the wire, the camp looked deceptively quiet. Rows of wooden huts, smoke curling from chimneys, men moving in groups with the slow precision of those who'd been waiting too long for anything to change. A British voice called out, "New arrivals, over here!" The man wore an old RAF cap, tilted at an angle that tried to remember pride. His name was Sergeant Hensley, camp clerk, unofficial storyteller, and keeper of rumors. When Nicholas gave his name, Hensley paused mid-note. "Alkemade, you're the one who fell, aren't you?" Nicholas frowned. "Word travels fast." Hensley grinned. "Miracles usually do." That night, in Hut 104, the story made the rounds. Every detail twisted in the retelling. Some said he'd bounced off the clouds. Others swore angels caught him mid-air. By lights out, half the camp believed he was immortal. Nicholas just smiled and let them talk. He didn't feel immortal. He still woke up sore. But the story gave something to the men that rations couldn't. Hope. Days passed. Routine set in. Roll call at dawn. Soup that wasn't soup. Barbed wire glinting in sunlight like false promises. Nicholas spent hours carving scraps of wood into tiny planes, sanding them smooth with ration tins. Hensley once asked him, "What's it like, knowing you shouldn't be here?" Nicholas shrugged. "Makes every breath feel borrowed." Then one evening a guard entered the hut carrying a folder. He handed it to Hensley, who squinted at the German stamps. "Official document," the guard said in broken English. "From Berlin, for Sergeant Alkemade." Inside were photographs, grainy black and white prints, the forest, the broken trees, the crater in the snow. On the bottom, in German script, bestätigt, kein Fallschirm benutzt, confirmed, no parachute used. The men stared at the images. For once, the barracks went quiet. Nicholas looked at the photo of the impact site. He could almost feel the wind again, the rush of air, the crack of branches. He smiled faintly. Guess I wasn't dreaming after all. Word spread again. But this time it wasn't rumor. It was record. He was officially the man who fell and lived. In a place built on hopeless repetition, his survival became a kind of rebellion. Men started talking about what they'd do after the war again. They laughed more. The guards noticed. Hensley said one night, "You realize you've done more for morale than all the escape attempts combined?" Nicholas laughed. "Not sure the trees planned it that way." Spring came. The snow melted, leaving mud and thawed footprints. Nicholas helped dig garden beds behind the huts, anything to make the earth grow again. Sometimes he'd stare at the horizon, wondering if the sky remembered him. But war has a way of circling back. Before long, the front was moving west, and with it came orders. The prisoners of Stalag Luft III were to be evacuated, and for Nicholas Alkemade, the man who couldn't die, the march ahead would test that reputation all over again. Nicholas Alkemade had survived falling from the sky. Now he'd have to survive something worse, walking through hell on earth. It began before dawn, February 1945. A frozen wind swept across the camp, snapping through the trees like a blade. Guards shouted orders. Boots pounded the frozen ground. The Russians were coming. The rumor hit the huts days before. The Eastern Front was collapsing, Soviet tanks rolling west. The Germans didn't want the POWs liberated, not yet. So they decided to move them. Hundreds of men, barely fed, barely dressed for the cold, marched west through snow that swallowed their ankles toward a horizon no one trusted. Nicholas tightened his scarf, a strip of old blanket, and joined the line. The wind clawed at his face. His leg still ached from the fall, a dull, familiar reminder that gravity wasn't done with him. They set off. The road cut through forests and abandoned villages. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling everything but the crunch of boots. Sometimes the guards shouted, but even they grew quiet after the first 20 miles. Nicholas walked beside Hensley, the camp clerk. "Remind me again," Hensley muttered, teeth chattering. "How did you survive falling out of the sky, but not this cold?" Nicholas smiled faintly. "Luck's got limits." By the second day, frostbite set in for some. They wrapped their feet in rags, shared crusts of bread. Every few miles, another man collapsed. Too weak, too cold. The guards dragged them to the side. No one looked back. Nicholas kept counting steps. When you fall, he thought, you only have seconds before the ground finds you. Here, the fall never ends, just slow, relentless descent into exhaustion. At night, they slept in barns, straw stiff with ice, walls breathing frost. Nicholas lay awake, staring at the rafters. Every creak sounded like flak exploding overhead. Every gust of wind brought back the weightless terror of falling. But there was one thing different now. He'd hit the ground once and lived. He wasn't about to give death a second chance. On the fourth night, the column passed through a small village near Nuremberg. The streets were empty, windows shattered, walls scorched black from bombings. A German woman stood in a doorway, holding a child, watching the procession of ragged prisoners trudge by. Nicholas met her eyes for a moment. Saw fear there, but also something else. Pity. He thought of Becker, the officer who had called him probable, of the pine trees that had caught him, of how every face in this war, enemy or not, seemed to wear the same quiet exhaustion. The march stretched for weeks. Snow gave way to mud, mud to dust. By the time they reached Bavaria, half the men were limping. Rations had vanished. Hope was the only thing left to chew. Hensley grew sick, fever, coughing, skin like wax. Nicholas stayed by him, sharing what little bread he had left. One night, Hensley whispered, "If I don't make it, tell them back home. Tell them your story." Nicholas shook his head. "You'll tell it yourself." But deep down, he knew the odds. Days later, Hensley couldn't walk. Nicholas carried him for a mile. 2, until his own legs nearly gave out. When the guards ordered him to drop the body, he didn't obey until the rifle butt hit his shoulder. He laid Hensley down gently in the snow. No words, just a quiet nod, a salute from one survivor to another. When the column finally stopped near Regensburg, the war was cracking open. Allied bombers roared overhead, their engines echoing like ghosts of the night he fell. Nicholas looked up at the sky. Same cold stars, same infinite dark. He thought about what it meant to fall, and to keep falling, even on your feet. He whispered to the wind, "I've already beaten you once. You'll have to try harder." The march ended when the guns of liberation began. But Nicholas Alkemade's story wasn't finished yet, because when the Allies found him and heard his tale, they didn't believe it either, not until the proof came straight from the enemy's files. Nicholas Alkemade had survived the fire, the fall, and the march, but there was one final enemy left: disbelief. Even his own countrymen thought the story was impossible. The war ended like a slow exhale. The guards were gone. The gates of the camp swung open without ceremony, just wind creaking through hinges that had forgotten how to move. Nicholas stood among the ruins of order, clutching a tin mug of cold coffee. All around him, prisoners were cheering, crying, running, collapsing. But he just stood still. Freedom, after captivity, felt unreal. Like waking from a dream you're not sure you survived. A week later, he was flown back to England. An RAF Dakota, unarmed, unthreatened, cruising over green fields instead of blackened cities. He stared out the window the whole way, watching the clouds drift below him. Same altitude, different fate. At RAF headquarters, they gave him tea, blankets, and a pile of forms that could have filled a small book. Name, rank, serial number, unit, mission date. Everything he remembered, written out like a confession. The officer interviewing him, a young lieutenant with 2 clean boots, frowned halfway through the report. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. You're saying you jumped without a parachute?" Nicholas nodded. The lieutenant blinked. "From how high?" 18,000 feet. There was a long pause. Then the scratching of a pencil stopped. "Are you certain?" "As certain as gravity." Word spread fast, faster than truth could keep up. Some officers laughed it off. Others called it delusion, a trauma-induced fantasy. A few even accused him of cowardice, suggesting he'd bailed low with a damaged chute. Nicholas didn't argue. He'd learned that proof mattered more than pride. And proof, as it turned out, was on its way, from Berlin. Weeks later, a courier arrived at the base carrying a sealed envelope marked Captured Documents Division. Inside, German reports recovered from Luftwaffe archives, stamped in official black ink. Sergeant Nicholas Stephen Alkemade, RAF, falls from 5,500 meters without parachute, survives with minor injuries, confirmed by Oberleutnant Becker, Luftwaffe. Attached were the same photographs, the crater in the snow, the broken pines, the burned remains of his parachute, and a statement, "No parachute found. Evidence consistent with free fall. Survivor displays calm temperament. Account accepted as factual." The room went silent. The officer who'd doubted him cleared his throat. "Well, that's that then." Nicholas smiled faintly. "Told you I packed light." Within days, the press got hold of it. Headlines exploded across Britain. "Airman survives fall from 18,000 feet. No parachute." The man who bounced back from death. Photographers came. Reporters came. He posed awkwardly, hands in pockets, uniform still singed at the cuffs. Every question was the same. "What went through your mind? Did you pray? Did you see anything? You see..." He'd answer the same way every time. "No, I just remember thinking it was quiet." But fame felt strange. He hadn't fought a glorious battle or destroyed enemy lines. He'd fallen, survived, and somehow that made him a hero. Sometimes at night he'd lie awake listening to the wind outside his flat, hearing the faint whistle of air rushing past him again. He could still feel the weightlessness, the strange calm before impact. Survival, he realized, wasn't the miracle. Acceptance was. Months later, Nicholas received a letter stamped Ministry of Defense. It read, "Your case has been reviewed and verified by both British and German authorities. The circumstances of your fall are recognized as authentic and without precedent. You are to be commended for composure under extraordinary conditions." He laughed when he read it. "Composure," he said aloud. "That's one way to say falling out of the sky." Years would pass before he told the story again in full. He returned to civilian life quietly, working in a factory, marrying, raising children. He never boasted, never exaggerated. When asked about the fall, he'd smile and say, "It wasn't my time, that's all." But those who met him could feel it, that quiet weight behind his eyes, like he still carried the sky inside him. Decades later, historians would find his name again, tucked inside an RAF archive, beside a faded German report stamped "Confirmed." And they'd ask the same question every generation does: how can a man fall from the heavens aboard and walk away? Nicholas Alkemade had returned home a living contradiction, the man gravity forgot. But what happens to someone who's already survived the impossible? England, spring 1946. The war was over, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the bombs had ever been. Cities were patchworked with new roofs and empty lots. Men came home different, quieter, slower, eyes that didn't blink the same way. Nicholas fit right in. He got a job at a chemical plant in Loughborough, working night shifts among the hum of machines. He said it reminded him of the bombers, the vibration underfoot, the smell of oil, the steady rhythm of work that kept thoughts away. Sometimes the younger workers would nudge each other when he passed. "That's him," they'd whisper, "the one who fell." He never corrected them. At the plant, there was a siren that went off every morning at 6. Every time it wailed, Nicholas flinched, not in fear, but in recognition. It was the same pitch as the dive alarm of a falling bomber. He used to joke, "The ground and I, we're old friends now," but he never went flying again, not once. Years later, when he finally agreed to speak publicly about the fall, he did it not to boast, but to teach. He spoke at air cadet meetings, small aviation clubs, veteran gatherings. He'd always start the same way. "I didn't survive because I was brave. I survived because nature decided to break my fall." Then he'd pause, letting the quiet settle. the same quiet that filled his mind during those seconds between sky and snow. "You can't control the height you fall from," he'd say softly, "but you can control how you hit the ground." In 1961, the BBC invited him for an interview. "The miracle airman," the reporter asked. "What was it like falling that far without a parachute?" Nicholas smiled. "Peaceful, until it wasn't." The studio audience laughed. He didn't. He continued, "I wasn't lucky. I just landed right. That's all any of us ever do in life. We fall, and if we're still breathing afterward, we call it luck." Over the years, his story made its way into RAF manuals, survival psychology lectures, even Guinness World Records. Greatest fall without parachute, survived. 18,000 feet, documented, verified. But Nicholas didn't care about records. He kept a small photo of his old crew instead, the 7 men who hadn't made it out that night over Germany. He'd take it out sometimes and set it beside his tea. "They burned," he once told a friend, "and I fell. I still don't know which was worse." When he retired, he moved to a quiet cottage near Norfolk, a place with endless trees. People said he liked it that way. He'd sit by the window watching wind ripple through pine branches, and sometimes smile faintly, as if hearing an old friend's voice. Once, a neighbor asked why he never planted anything else. Nicholas just pointed at the pines. "They caught me once," he said. "Figure I owe them the view." By the time he passed away in 1987, age 64, the world had changed again. Jets instead of propellers, Cold War instead of firestorms. But his name still lingered in aviation circles, a ghost story told in hangars and pubs. The gunner who fell and lived. Decades later, museum curators found his Luftwaffe paperwork preserved perfectly, stamped Glaubwürdig, credible. His watch still ticking. His burned uniform folded neatly beside the report that had once saved him from disbelief. Visitors would stop and read the short summary beneath the display. Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade, RAF, fell from 18,000 feet without a parachute, survived with minor injuries, March 24th, 1944. And every time someone would whisper, "No way," just like they did in that German farmhouse 40 years before. But Nicholas's story wasn't just about survival. It was about what comes after. Because when you've already fallen from the sky and lived, how do you ever come back down to earth? Nicholas Alkemade had become a legend, the man who fell through the sky and lived. But legends, when left alone, start asking questions. Why me? Why survive when so many didn't? The cottage was quiet in winter. The old RAF mug by the window always steamed a little too long before cooling. Nicholas sat in his armchair, a blanket over his knees, a faded photograph on the table beside him. 7 faces, smiling, all gone since 1944. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, steady, soft. He watched it through the glass, and for a moment the years peeled away. The snow looked the same as it had that night, falling sideways, the wind howling, the air thick with smoke. He could almost hear the engines again, the creak of the turret, the captain shouting, "Bail out," and then that one impossible second, when he realized he'd already run out of parachute and choices and maybe life, but life had chosen otherwise. He once told a friend, "People think surviving makes you fearless. It doesn't. It just makes you aware that everything after that moment is extra." That was how he lived, quietly, deliberately, as though every small act was borrowed time he didn't want to waste. He liked repairing watches. "Small things," he'd say, holding the tiny gears with tweezers. "They remind me the world still ticks, even when you fall." One evening, a young reporter from a local paper came to interview him. Just a small piece for the Sunday supplement. She was polite, nervous, barely out of school. She asked the question they all asked. What did it feel like? Nicholas chuckled softly. "Like falling through time," he said. Then he thought for a moment and added, "There's no fear once you've accepted it, just peace, the strange kind that comes when you've got nothing left to hold on to." She frowned. So you weren't afraid? He smiled. Oh, I was terrified. But fear only matters when you think it can change the ending. Later that night, after she left, Nicholas sat by the fire and turned the question inward. What did it really mean, to fall and live? It wasn't luck, he thought. Luck was random. This felt deliberate, even if he'd never understand by whom. He remembered Becker, the German officer who'd believed him when no one else did. He remembered the snow, the quiet, the taste of pine sap on his tongue when he woke up alive. He'd once tried to explain it in a letter to an old crewmate's family. I don't think I survived because I was meant to. I think I survived so I could remember. He carried that memory like a duty. Every March 24th, he'd walk out to the woods behind his house, stand under the tallest tree and look straight up. He'd stand there for a long time, not saying anything, as if waiting for gravity to notice him again. Sometimes he'd laugh, sometimes he'd cry, sometimes he'd do both. As he grew older, he found comfort in the small absurdities of survival. The fact that his watch had kept running while he fell, that his pack of cigarettes had survived intact in his pocket, that he'd joked with the Gestapo on the night he landed. It was all too strange to take seriously, so he didn't. He took it humbly. When he was asked once if he believed in fate, he paused. I believe in physics, he said, smiling. Everything that falls must hit something. I just happened to hit the right thing. Then, after a beat, he added quietly, and maybe that was fate after all. The years blurred like clouds passing overhead. By the end of his life, Nicholas's story had been told in every way possible, documentaries, radio programs, books, and even children's comics. But he never read them. He preferred the version in his head. The silent fall, the stars watching, the branches rising to meet him. That was enough. Before he died, Nicholas Alkemade left a single note taped inside his watch case. It said, "Don't fear falling, fear forgetting why you got back up." And those words would outlive even the man who fell without a parachute. Nicholas Alkemade was gone, but stories like his don't end, they echo. Each retelling isn't just about the man who fell, but about the question he left behind. Why did he live when so many didn't? It began quietly. A historian sorting through post-war RAF files stumbled across a faded folder labeled Unusual Incidents, Aircrew. Inside, the original German report, Becker's signature, and a note from a British officer, Case verified, survivor calm, event unprecedented. He read it twice, then 3 more times, unable to believe the words. A free fall from 18,000 feet, no parachute, minimal injuries. And it wasn't a rumor, it was evidence, sealed and stamped. He called the RAF Museum at Hendon. Within weeks, the exhibit was planned. They displayed his uniform, singed at the cuffs, the Luftwaffe report in a glass frame, his wristwatch still ticking faintly from a careful restoration, and a photo of the forest near Schmallenberg, where snow once caught a falling man. The plaque beneath it read, "Some stories defy explanation. This one doesn't need one." Visitors came in quiet waves, school children on tours, veterans in wheelchairs, pilots who'd flown jets that made the old Lancasters look prehistoric. They all stopped at the same display. Some stared, some laughed in disbelief. One elderly pilot simply muttered, "Bloody hell," and removed his cap. News cameras arrived next. A reporter asked one curator, "Do you think it really happened?" The curator smiled. "There's a German officer's signature, a crater in the snow, and a living witness who told the same story until his death. If it didn't happen, the universe went to extraordinary trouble to fake it." Across decades, Nicholas's story became something more than survival. It became metaphor. For airmen, it meant hope. For engineers, the limits of physics. For everyone else, the strange truth that sometimes the world chooses mercy for no reason at all. Psychologists began citing it in studies of resilience. Military instructors quoted it during lectures on composure under pressure. A phrase even entered training slang, pulling an Alkemade, meaning surviving what should have killed you. In 2014, 70 years after his fall, a documentary team traveled to Germany to find the forest. The trees had grown taller, the snow melted into spring soil. But the locals still knew the story. An old farmer led them to the spot. "Here," he said, pointing to a stand of pines. "My father found him, said he looked more surprised than hurt." They filmed it in silence, the wind through the trees sounding almost like the rush of air through an open sky. At the end of the segment, the narrator spoke softly. "Some men fight fate. Some fall through it. Nicholas Alkemade fell through both and lived." In air museums and history books, his name remains a footnote, but one that refuses to fade. Students still write essays about him. Pilots still mention him in training rooms. And every now and then, someone still asks the same question Becker once asked across that desk in 1944. How can a man fall from the heavens and survive? The answer always depends on who you ask. The scientist says, physics. The soldier says, luck. The priest says, providence. But maybe Nicholas himself said it best. I fell. The trees caught me. Everything else is detail. Even now, if you visit that patch of forest, you can hear it. The wind moving through the branches like the whisper of a long unfinished story. Each gust, a reminder that falling isn't the end. It's just the start of how you land. And so, decades later, the legend of Nicholas Alkemade still circles the earth, a story that refuses gravity, a memory suspended between the impossible and the undeniable. Because sometimes history doesn't break the fall, it carries it. For 80 years, Nicholas Alkemade's story has refused to die. It isn't just the tale of a man who survived a fall, it's the proof that some souls never hit the ground. The forest is quiet now. The air smells of moss and rain. If you stand there long enough, you can almost feel it. The weight of something that once fell from the sky and refused to break. A small plaque rests at the base of a pine. It reads, "In memory of Sergeant Nicholas Stephen Alkemade, RAF. Fell 18,000 feet without a parachute. Lived to tell the story." Visitors leave things there sometimes. A poppy, a model plane. A folded note that says, "You make me believe again." Time has thinned the edges of his story, but not its pulse. Every retelling is a reminder, not of luck, but of what survival really means. It means you hit the ground and still get up. It means you keep walking, even when the world burns around you. It means the human spirit, fragile as glass, sometimes bends instead of shattering. And maybe that's why Nicholas's story endures. Because every generation needs proof that the impossible can still happen. In archives, his official report still reads clinical and cold. Subject jumped from burning Lancaster over Schmallenberg. No parachute. Landed in snow-covered forest. Sustained minor injuries. Event confirmed. 5 lines, that's all history gave him. 5 lines for 18,000 feet. 5 lines for the line between life and death. But between those lines, there's everything else. The silence, the wind, the smell of pine and fire. The moment a falling man realized he was still alive. If you asked him what mattered most, he probably wouldn't mention the fall. He'd talk about the men he served with, about the friends who didn't come home, about Becker, the German who believed him. He once said in a letter, "The war made me understand that enemies are only strangers caught in the same fire." That line ended up carved into the base of his gravestone. No medals, no ranks, just that. The legend of Nicholas Alkemade isn't about defying gravity. It's about defying despair. Because the night he fell, the world was on fire, and yet something soft still waited below. A forest, a second chance, a reminder that even in a war built on destruction, nature still made room for mercy. When historians speak of miracles of war, they mention Stalingrad, Dunkirk, Hiroshima. But somewhere in that list, quieter, humbler, there's a name that doesn't sound like a battle. Just a man, falling through the dark, finding grace at 120 miles an hour. If you ever look up on a cold March night and see the sky flicker with faint auroras over Europe, imagine it. A small figure tumbling through that same darkness, hands open, not fighting the fall. Because Nicholas Alkemade didn't win a war. He didn't change history. He just proved, in the simplest, purest way, that humanity endures. And that's how his story ends. Not with the crash of an aircraft or the stamp of a report, but with a man walking away from death, brushing snow off his uniform and whispering, "Well, that's new." Epilogue. 18,000 feet. No parachute. No miracle claimed. Only physics, pine trees, and a will to live. Nicholas Alkemade, the man who fell without a parachute, and reminded the world that sometimes the smallest mercy is enough to change the course of history. Because in the end, he didn't just survive the fall. He survived everything after it. And that's what makes his story worth remembering. Nicholas Alkemade's story ended with survival. But stories like his never really end. They just rise again every time someone looks up and wonders what it feels like to fall. 70 years after that night, the forest in Schmallenberg still stood, taller, quieter, older. The pines swayed in a slow rhythm, whispering to the sky that once swallowed a man whole and then gave him back. A drone camera flew overhead, filming the canopy for a modern documentary. The director spoke softly into his headset. "Keep rolling. This is where he landed." From above, the trees looked like green waves frozen mid-motion. No crater remained, no mark of impact. Just the same hush of wind that once cushioned a body from 18,000 feet. The crew went silent. Even with all their modern tech, all their lenses and microphones, there was something sacred here they couldn't quite capture. The invisible boundary between impossible and real. Later that night, as they packed up, the youngest cameraman, barely 20, asked the director, "Do you believe it actually happened?" The director paused, looking at the endless stretch of sky. "I believe the sky remembers," he said, "and that's enough." When the film aired months later, millions watched. Viewers wrote comments that filled the screen like confessions. "I showed this to my dad, a pilot. He cried. I was ready to give up on everything. Then I saw this." Sometimes we don't need a reason to live, just a landing that doesn't kill us. The story found new life in a new generation. A generation that had never seen war, but still knew what it meant to fall. In classrooms, teachers used it to talk about perspective. In therapy groups, it became a symbol of post-traumatic growth. In flight academies, cadets read it before their first solo flights, a reminder that fear is not the enemy, panic is. One instructor told his students, "When you're up there and something goes wrong, remember Alkemade. Keep your head. The sky only spares those who stay calm enough to meet it." The RAF added a small module in its survival psychology program titled The Alkemade Principle. It didn't teach how to fall. It taught how to accept the fall, how to remain present when the world collapses around you. A slide in the presentation read, "Courage is not denying the fall. It's facing it without closing your eyes." That line came from one of Nicholas's old letters, rediscovered in an archive box in 2019. The letter was addressed to an unnamed friend, dated years after the war. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. "I didn't fall because I was brave. I was brave because I fell. The world took everything from me that night, noise, control, light, and in that silence, I met myself." The last sentence had been underlined twice. That letter now sits in a display case beside his watch in the RAF museum, illuminated under glass. It's not the fall that draws people's eyes. It's those words. When the museum closes each evening, the lights dim, but the faint ticking of that restored watch continues. The sound is steady, patient, like the heartbeat of a man who fell through darkness and found the rhythm again. If you stand there long enough, you can hear it, a soft reminder that time, like gravity, never stops pulling, but sometimes it lets go. In a world obsessed with control, Nicholas Alkemade's story still feels radical. He didn't conquer nature. He didn't outwit physics. He surrendered and was spared. There's a lesson buried in that surrender, one even the greatest soldiers forget. Sometimes you survive not by fighting, but by falling the right way. Somewhere in the night sky over Germany, perhaps, the ghost of that Lancaster still burns. And beneath it, one man still falls endlessly, gently, eternally, not toward death, but toward the snow that caught him. Because maybe Nicholas never stopped falling. Maybe he's still up there. not as a man defying gravity, but as a whisper between sky and earth, reminding us that no matter how far we drop, there's always something, or someone, waiting to catch us. Nicholas Alkemade's body hit the ground in 1944, but his story never landed, because what he left behind wasn't a miracle, it was a message. You don't need to fall from the sky to understand him. You just need to have lost something: control, certainty, belief, and kept breathing anyway. That's what his story really is, the anatomy of surrender. When the fire closed in, he didn't bargain. He didn't scream. He accepted. And in that single act of acceptance, the world caught him. There's a kind of defiance in that, not the loud kind that waves a flag, but the quiet kind that whispers, "All right, if this is how it ends, I'll face it standing still." That's what makes Nicholas different from every tale of luck or physics. His survival wasn't about odds, it was about presence. When people talk about courage, they think of resistance, holding on, fighting back, never letting go. But Nicholas showed the opposite. Real courage is the moment you release everything, even fear, and fall with your eyes open. That's not defeat, that's understanding. In a psychology lecture decades later, a professor used his story to define what he called the calm before impact. He explained that soldiers, survivors, even crash victims who lived through impossible circumstances often described a similar state: a strange stillness, a suspension of panic, a surrender that wasn't giving up. It was trusting something larger to decide the outcome. He wrote on the board, "Acceptance is not resignation. It's awareness at the edge of chaos." And beneath it, he wrote one name: Nicholas Alkemade. In that sense, the story isn't really about one man falling through clouds. It's about everyone who's ever watched something they built burn, a dream, a love, a life, and thought, this is it. And then somehow they kept going. We all fall, in different ways. But Nicholas proved something the rest of us forget. It's not the fall that kills you, it's forgetting that the ground might forgive you. If you could see the forest where he landed, you'd understand. It isn't marked by wreckage or tragedy. It's quiet, peaceful, still alive. And that's fitting, because that's what he became too. Not a story of war, but of life continuing after it. When his daughter was asked what her father's story meant to her, she said, "He wasn't proud of surviving. He was grateful. He used to tell me, 'I didn't cheat death. I borrowed time.'" Borrowed time. That's what every survivor learns to live with. It's not endless. It's not fair. But it's enough. So when people read about Nicholas now, in textbooks, documentaries, Reddit threads, history channels, they see more than a war story. They see proof that sometimes the world breaks its own rules just to let one person through. And maybe that's why, in a century of destruction, this one quiet story still echoes louder than 1,000 battles. Because it reminds us that survival isn't about beating death. It's about choosing life again, every single day after. If Nicholas Alkemade were alive today, he'd probably laugh at all of this. He'd say he was no hero. He'd tell you he was just lucky. But then, if you pressed him, if you asked what really went through his mind while falling through the night, he might say something like this: "I stopped fighting. I stopped fearing. I just fell. And somehow, that was enough." The snow that saved him melted long ago. The war that made him fall has ended. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in silence. That no fall is final, no ending absolute, and no one too far gone to be caught by something unseen. 18,000 feet, one man, no parachute, no panic, only peace. And in that peace, a truth still floats above history, that sometimes when you let go, the world holds you up.